A deal with the Mafia. The scent of sizzling garlic and freshly cut basil filled the cramped, dimly lit kitchen of Tony's Takeaway. Lorenzo DeLuka, once the most feared young Mafia boss in the city, now stood over the stove, flipping a pan of pasta like a seasoned chef. The world knew him as ruthless, calculating, a man who ruled with an iron fist. But tonight, he was just another cook in a dodgy takeaway, escaping the weight of a life he never chose but inherited. Cooking had become his solace, the only thing that made him feel human. Amidst the bloodshed and expectations that came with his name, he had grown up in a world where trust was a weakness, where love was something used as leverage rather than given freely. But here, in the heat of the kitchen, he controlled the outcome. There were no betrayals, no violence, just the simple act of creating something nourishing. It was the closest thing to peace he had ever known. Here, no one looked at him with fear or reverence. He was just Lorenzo, a man finding comfort in the simple act of creating something with his hands instead of destroying it. Yet, even in this quiet refuge, the past had a way of creeping in, a shadow he could never fully escape. "Order up," he called out, plating a serving of pasta al pomodoro. The bell chimed, signaling a delivery was arriving. Lorenzo stepped out, his hands dusting off the flour on his apron. But before he could react, headlights beamed straight into his eyes, and a car swerved dangerously close. It wasn't just reckless driving, it was deliberate, an attempt on his life, a blur of motion, then a rough shove. He hit the ground with a grunt just as the vehicle sped past, missing him by mere inches. His pulse thundered as he realized someone had just tried to kill him. "Are you insane?" A woman's voice pierced through the moment, breathless and sharp. Lorenzo blinked, his amber eyes settling on his savior. She was small but fierce, her dark brown hair tied messily, strands sticking to her face. A delivery bag slung over her shoulder, a name tag barely legible. "Emily." She glared at him. "You were about to get yourself killed." Lorenzo smirked, amused. "And you saved me." Emily narrowed her eyes, studying the way his lips curved slightly in amusement. He seemed too relaxed for someone who had just survived what could have been a deadly accident. Why did he find this so funny? Was this just a game to him? Her heart still pounded from the adrenaline, but she masked it with a scoff. "It wasn't intentional. I just didn't want my order delayed." Lorenzo chuckled, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a sleek black card. He studied her for a moment, realizing she had no idea what she had just done. She thought she had simply prevented a careless accident, but Lorenzo knew better. That car wasn't just a reckless driver. It was a deliberate attempt on his life. If she hadn't been there, he might not be standing now. He didn't like being in anyone's debt. That was a dangerous place to be in his world. He handed her the card, his voice lower, more serious. "I don't like owing people favors. If you ever need anything, call me." She hesitated before taking it. "Doubt I'll ever need the help of a stranger." But fate had a cruel sense of irony. Emily had spent her life struggling. No matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. Her mother favored her sister Amelia, giving her everything while Emily was left to survive on scraps. Her father? A silent shadow, never defending her, never acknowledging her pain. Her childhood had been a series of bruises hidden beneath long sleeves and meals that barely filled her stomach. The sharp sting of a belt was a lesson in obedience. The cruel words whispered behind closed doors, a reminder that she was nothing. Nights of hunger turned into years of exhaustion. Her only solace, the thought that one day she would escape. But escape was an illusion. She clawed her way through university, juggling classes and endless jobs, pushing herself beyond her limits. She could not even afford to buy a laptop for herself, forced to rent the ones available at the university. To cover the rental fees, she had to take on extra shifts, sneaking in the extra work without her mother knowing. The exhaustion was suffocating, but she had no other choice. She graduated as a computer engineer, a title that should have been her salvation. Yet, it wasn't. Every paycheck she earned, her mother snatched away with entitled fingers, draining her dry before she could taste even a moment of freedom. "You should be grateful, Emily," her mother often reminded her, lips curling in disgust. "Everything I do is for your sister." Emily was never enough, never worthy, never wanted. Then came Amelia's engagement. A grand wedding was needed and money was short. Her mother, of course, had a solution. First, she forced Emily into yet another job, cleaning fish at a local market. The work was grueling, the smell unbearable, and the pay barely enough to cover a fraction of the wedding expenses. But her mother was unsatisfied, grumbling about how slow the money was coming in. One evening, as Emily arrived home reeking of fish and exhaustion, her mother sneered at her. "This isn't working fast enough. We need real money." Emily barely had the energy to reply before her mother continued. "You'll marry Mr. Russo." She announced it like it was the most natural solution, sipping her tea as if she hadn't just condemned her daughter to a life of misery. Emily's blood ran cold. "He's old enough to be my father. He's rich." Emily clenched her fists. "I won't do it." Her mother's slap came fast, sharp, and cruel. "You will." Panic clawed at her chest. She was trapped, caged, with no savings, no escape. Desperation made her fingers tremble as she searched through her things. Then she found it. The black card. A name burned into the glossy surface, Lorenzo DeLuka. With a shaking breath, she dialed the number. A deep voice answered after the first ring. "Who is this?" She swallowed. "You owe me a favor." The moment Lorenzo heard her voice, something in his gut twisted. It wasn't just the recognition. It was something deeper, something unfamiliar. Desperation was something he understood, but there was something about the way she spoke, the way her voice trembled but didn't break, that unsettled him. He had spent his life around people who begged for their lives, but Emily wasn't begging. She was fighting. And it stirred something in him he wasn't ready to name. He remembered Emily, the fire in her eyes, the sharpness of her tongue. But the woman on the phone sounded different. Broken. Desperate. "Where are you?" She barely had time to explain before the door was yanked open, and her mother's furious face loomed over her. With a vicious snatch, she grabbed Emily's phone. "You think you can run?" her mother screeched. "Tomorrow morning you're getting married at the town hall. Everything is arranged. Mr. Russo has already paid." Emily's heart pounded as she tried to wrestle back the phone, but her mother shoved her away. In the chaos, the line was still open, but she couldn't answer Lorenzo before the call went dead. Lorenzo had heard everything. His blood boiled and his grip on the phone tightened. Emily didn't just need help. She needed to be saved, and he was going to make sure that happened. The next morning, just as Emily's mother and father dragged her into the town hall, Lorenzo arrived. He stepped in with a calm, deadly presence that made the entire room fall silent. "I believe this wedding is off." His voice was smooth, dangerous. Emily's mother's face twisted in fury before her lips curled into a sneer. "So this is why you've been acting out," she spat. "You've got yourself a boyfriend, haven't you? A secret lover sneaking around behind my back? How dare you shame this family, you ungrateful wretch?" She took a step closer, her voice a venomous hiss. "You think running to him will save you? You are nothing without us." Then, as if a switch had flipped, her rage melted into calculated greed. She turned to Lorenzo, her expression shifting. "You want her?" her mother sneered. "Then pay us what Mr. Russo was giving. We don't give away things for free." Emily's stomach twisted in humiliation, but before she could speak, Lorenzo moved closer, towering over them. "She isn't a thing to be sold, and you've taken enough from her." Her mother scoffed. "She's not leaving unless she gets married. If it's not Mr. Russo, then it has to be someone else." Emily's breath hitched. She turned to Lorenzo, shaking her head. "I can't ask you to do this, just... Never mind. Let them marry me off." Lorenzo's gaze darkened, his jaw tightening. "No," he said firmly. "That's not happening." He turned to Emily's parents with an air of finality. I'll marry her. Emily's eyes widened in shock. Lorenzo, my mother is going to be very pleased, he murmured, almost amused, before locking eyes with her. Trust me. This is the best way. Before Emily could protest, he pulled her toward the exit, leaving her stunned parents behind. His men stepped forward, making it clear the conversation was over. Without another word, Lorenzo took Emily's hand, pulling her away from the life that had chained her for so long. He studied her, noting the fading bruise on her wrist. His jaw clenched. Tell me everything. At first she hesitated, but then it poured out. The years of abuse, the neglect, the forced marriage. By the time she finished, Lorenzo's hands were tight on the steering wheel. No one owns you, Emily? His voice was steel. Least of all them. She let out a humorless laugh. I have nowhere to go. No money. They've taken everything. Lorenzo's lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. Then I'll take everything from them. Instead of taking Emily to his mansion where his true identity would be impossible to hide, Lorenzo drove Emily to a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. It was the home of his mother, a woman who had always lived away from the dangerous world he ruled. He hadn't told Emily who he truly was yet, and for now, he preferred to keep it that way. As they pulled into the driveway, Emily glanced at the house, confusion flickering in her tired eyes. This is your place? She asked hesitantly. Lorenzo smirked slightly. Number my mother's. You'll be safe here. She hesitated before speaking again. And the men who were with you at the town hall? My friends, he said simply. They owed me a favor. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line, sensing there was more to his words but too exhausted to push. The door swung open before they even reached it, revealing a short, chubby woman with warm brown eyes and a beaming smile. Lorenzo, she gasped, pulling him into a tight hug before her gaze fell on Emily. And who is this lovely girl? Lorenzo gave Emily a knowing look before turning back to his mother. This is Emily, my wife. Silence fell like a heavy curtain. Emily's heart nearly stopped, her mind racing as she opened her mouth to protest. But before she could utter a word, Lorenzo squeezed her hand discreetly, his grip firm, silencing her. His mother stood frozen for a moment, her round face a canvas of shock. Then, to Emily's surprise, tears welled in her warm brown eyes. My boy. Finally. You've never brought a girl home before. I thought you'd never settle down. Emily's stomach twisted. She glanced at Lorenzo, but he merely gave her an unreadable smirk. Before she could react, his mother lunged forward, enveloping her in a tight, warm embrace. Welcome to the family, my dear. You must be exhausted. Oh, look at you, so thin. We need to feed you properly. Emily stiffened in the woman's hold, unused to such affection. It was overwhelming. Jarring, even. Mama, Lorenzo chuckled, stepping in to gently pry her off. Let's get inside first. His mother beamed, wiping her eyes. Of course, of course. Come in, come in. I'll make some tea and something to eat. You must be starving. As Emily stepped over the threshold, she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had just exchanged one world of chaos for another, but for the first time, she wasn't alone. The next morning, Emily woke up in an unfamiliar yet comforting place, Lorenzo's mother's home. She had been given a warm bed, a place where no one looked at her with contempt. For the first time in years, she had slept soundly. But what truly stunned her was what she found waiting for her in the living room. A state-of-the-art desktop PC, a sleek laptop, a tablet, and a brand-new phone sat on a wooden table, neatly arranged. Lorenzo leaned casually against the wall, watching her reaction with amusement. A computer engineer without proper technology doesn't seem right, he remarked with a smirk. Emily's mouth opened slightly, her heart hammering. Lorenzo, this is too much. He shrugged. Consider it an investment. I'm sure you'll put it to good use. Before she could respond, his mother bustled in, beaming. Oh, my dear, Lorenzo never surprises anyone like this. You must be very special. Come, breakfast is ready. Emily blinked back unexpected emotion, nodding as she let herself be led to the dining table. Maybe, just maybe, life had finally taken a turn in her favor. Later that night, Emily sat at the desk in her room, fingers gliding over the sleek new keyboard. She had been up for hours, working, though, if she was being honest, she had spent half the time researching something else. Lorenzo DeLuka. The name had gnawed at her mind for weeks, ever since he had pulled her from the abyss of her past. She had searched before, but now, with the powerful new system at her fingertips, she found everything she had been missing. Crime reports, whispers of power, a name spoken in fear across the underworld. Her stomach twisted as she read article after article. He wasn't just someone with connections. He was the connection. The ruthless leader of a syndicate that controlled half the city. And she had married him. A knock at her door startled her and she slammed the laptop shut. But it was too late. Lorenzo leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his golden-hued eyes studying her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his gaze. Amusement, curiosity, maybe even possession. He stepped closer, the air between them growing charged, his presence overwhelming the small room. "You're a terrible liar, Tesoro," he murmured, tilting his head slightly. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" "You're a terrible liar, Tesoro," he mused, his tone as smooth as silk. "Did you really think I would notice when my wife starts snooping?" Emily swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "You knew I'd look you up, didn't you?" He stepped inside, his presence filling the room. "Of course, I was just waiting for you to say something." She took a slow breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "So it's true then? Everything they say about you?" Lorenzo didn't flinch. "Depends on what you believe. The world paints me as a villain because I do what's necessary. But I've never lied to you, Emily." Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She should have been afraid. She should have run. But instead, she met his gaze head-on. "Why didn't you tell me?" His expression softened, and for a moment something raw flickered across his face. "Because for once in my life I wanted someone to look at me like I was just a man. Not a king. Not a monster. Just Lorenzo." The air between them grew heavy, charged with an unspoken intensity. Emily exhaled shakily. "And what am I supposed to do with this information?" Lorenzo reached out, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "That's up to you, Tesoro. But know this. Nothing has changed. You are still safe with me, especially with my mum." Emily held his gaze, searching for deception but finding none. The realization hit her like a slow, burning ember. She believed him. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most dangerous part of all. Lorenzo had planned everything meticulously, awaiting Amelia's wedding, letting Emily's family believe they had won. As she stepped into the grand venue, she felt a stark contrast to the girl they had once belittled. The Emily they knew had been broken, desperate. But the woman standing before them now was different. Strong, confident, untouchable. She glanced at Lorenzo, whose presence beside her was unwavering. The gown he had chosen for her draped her figure elegantly, her hair and nails perfectly done, a statement that she was no longer their pawn. She felt the power in her own skin, the quiet revenge in her appearance alone. And when she met their judgmental stares with nothing but cold indifference, she knew. This time, she was the one in control. He said nothing about his plans, but without hesitation, they continued their cruelty towards Emily at the wedding, even Amelia's new husband sneering at her as if she were beneath them. Emily had wanted to attend, not to reconcile, but to show them what they had lost. She refused to appear broken before them. Lorenzo had made sure of that. Since she had left her parents' house with nothing, he had taken her shopping, pampering her in a way she had never experienced before. Her nails were freshly done, her hair styled to perfection, and the dress he had chosen for her hugged her figure in a way that made her feel powerful for the first time in her life. She walked into the venue with her head held high, standing beside Lorenzo, and for the first time, she wasn't the one cowering. She was the one being admired, envied, and they hated it. For the first time, she saw fear in her mother's eyes, not fear of losing control, but fear of realizing she had lost her forever. Lorenzo remained silent, his expression unreadable, but his grip on Emily's hand tightened subtly. His grip tightened, not just for show, but because for the first time in years, he wanted to hold on to something real. He told himself it was for show, a display of dominance in front of the people who had wronged her. But deep down he knew the truth. He didn't want to let go. He had spent years building walls, ensuring no one could reach him, but Emily had walked into his life and shattered every carefully constructed barrier. He leaned toward her ear and whispered, "Let them have their moment. They have no idea what's coming." As the evening unfolded, Emily endured the taunts, the cold glances, the humiliation. But when the night ended, Lorenzo stood tall, his presence imposing. He walked up to Emily's mother, his voice cold yet deliberate. "Enjoy this night. It will be the last time you stand so high. Tomorrow you will see what it's like to lose everything." Before her mother could reply, Lorenzo turned, gently guiding Emily away from the gathering. "Come, my love. We have better places to be." Emily glanced up at him, her heart pounding. "Lorenzo, what did you mean?" He smirked, pressing a kiss to her temple, his lips lingering just a second longer than necessary. "You'll see." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine, but it wasn't from fear. There was something intoxicating about the way he looked at her, like she was the most important thing in his world. She swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. "Lorenzo," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "Why do I feel like you're always one step ahead?" He chuckled, his fingers brushing against hers as he led her away. "Because I am, Tesoro. And when I make a promise, I always deliver." Meanwhile, Emily had been healing, settling into a quiet routine of working online. She had mentioned little about it to Lorenzo, simply telling him, "I'll pay you back one day." But Lorenzo had only given her a calm look and replied, "You don't owe me anything." The next morning, as the family basked in their supposed triumph, an eviction notice arrived. Lorenzo had secretly purchased the house they had been renting, and with their overdue payments, he wasted no time in throwing them out onto the street. Emily's mother wailed in disbelief. Amelia and her husband nowhere to be found. Amelia had washed her hands of her family the moment she was married. That morning, Lorenzo took Emily for a drive. "I have a surprise for you," he said, smirking slightly. When they arrived, Emily's mother was in the midst of sobbing, pleading with the landlord, who no longer was the owner of the property. When she spotted Emily, her cries turned desperate. "Emily, please, you have to help us. We have nowhere to go." Emily looked at the woman who had done nothing but take from her. She expected anger, sadness, maybe even pity, but all she felt was an overwhelming sense of finality. The girl who once begged for love and validation was gone. In her place stood a woman who had found her worth, who no longer needed their approval, their crumbs of affection. She had seen more love and compassion from Lorenzo's mother than she had in a lifetime from her own. The warmth of a home where she was cared for, where she was not treated as a burden, had opened her eyes to what she had been deprived of for so long. It had taken a stranger's kindness to show her what family was supposed to feel like, and she would never settle for anything less again. For years she had been made to believe she was nothing. But standing there, watching her mother crumble under the weight of her own choices, Emily realized she had always been something, someone strong enough to survive, to rise above the pain. She had finally reclaimed her life, and she wasn't about to give it back. No more nights of crying herself to sleep, no more begging for scraps of affection, no more being treated like she was less than nothing. For the first time in her life, she was free. Her mother's voice trembled with desperation, but Emily remained still, her heart steady. There was no need for vengeance, no lingering resentment, only the quiet satisfaction that she was no longer under her mother's control. Without a word, she turned away and walked back to Lorenzo's car, leaving her mother's pleas behind. A ghost of her past she had finally let go. But Lorenzo wasn't done yet. Later that week, he took Emily to a high-rise building, leading her into a sleek conference room where Amelia's husband sat, poised to sign a major business deal. But the moment Lorenzo walked in with Emily at his side, the man's face went pale. Lorenzo pulled out the contract, letting it drop onto the table. "Unfortunately, there's been a change of plans," he said smoothly. "I no longer do business with men who disrespects me and my wife." Emily's breath hitched at his words, but she said nothing as Amelia and her husband's world came crashing down. A slow realization settled in her chest. This was justice, delivered in a way she had never imagined. For years, she had been the one suffering, the one forced to endure their cruelty. But now the tables had turned. She glanced up at Lorenzo, who watched the scene with a calm, almost satisfied expression. His grip on her hand was firm, grounding. She felt a strange warmth spread through her, not just from relief, but something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster. Lorenzo's voice was low, meant only for her. "They had this coming for a long time, Tesoro, and I always take care of what's mine." But as the words left his lips, he realized just how much he meant them. Emily wasn't just a woman he had saved. She was becoming something more, and that terrified him. A shiver ran down her spine, but it wasn't fear. It was something dangerously close to admiration, maybe even longing. She squeezed his hand back, meeting his gaze. For the first time, she didn't feel powerless. She felt protected. And maybe, just maybe, she felt something else too. Lorenzo had taken more than their home. He had stripped them of their future, leaving them with nothing but the bitter consequences of their own cruelty. As they walked out of the building, Lorenzo turned to Emily, his voice softer than before. "You don't have to look back anymore, Tesoro. They mean nothing to you now." Emily hesitated for a moment, her heart still racing from the encounter. Lorenzo noticed and gently reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Come on, Tesoro. We have a future to focus on." She looked up at him, warmth filling her chest at his touch. "I never thought I'd be free of them," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Lorenzo lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. Their lips moved in perfect sync, as if this moment had been written long before either of them realized it. A silent vow, a binding promise. She was his and he was hers. He had never been one for sentimentality, never indulged in anything that made him feel vulnerable. But with Emily, it was different. She had already seen parts of him no one else had, and instead of running, she had stayed. That was worth more than he could ever put into words. His lips lingered for a moment, warm and deliberate, sending a shiver up Emily's spine. Her breath hitched, her pulse quickening at the unexpected tenderness in his touch. She glanced up at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery, but all she found was quiet intensity. His eyes, golden and unwavering, held hers, as if he were silently assuring her that she was safe, that she belonged there, with him. Her fingers curled slightly against his palm, feeling the strength and warmth of his hold. "Lorenzo, you've been stuck with me through all of this. Now that everything is over, if you want to be free, you can divorce me." His grip tightened and a rare seriousness crossed his features. "Divorce you?" He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Tesoro, you are everything and more than I could ever want in a woman." Emily's breath caught. Her chest tightened with emotions she couldn't yet name, a longing so deep it shook her to the core. Lorenzo's golden gaze darkened with something deeper, desire, devotion. He cupped her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek before he leaned in, brushing his lips over hers, slow and unyielding. Time seemed to stretch between them, the air thick with anticipation. Emily's breath hitched as warmth spread through her, her fingers digging gently into his jacket as she steadied herself against the flood of emotions. She felt the heat of his body, the firmness of his grip as his arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer. Lorenzo's heart pounded in his chest, a rare vulnerability creeping in as he deepened the kiss. She wasn't just anyone. She was the woman who had seen his shadows and still stood by his side. His hand trailed down her spine, holding her like she was something precious, something he wasn't willing to let go of. Emily melted into him completely, her body responding instinctively to his touch. She had never felt anything like this before, this sense of belonging, of safety, of a love that burned so intensely it left no room for doubt. As they broke apart, Lorenzo rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling. "You're mine, Tesoro," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "And I'm yours." Emily's lips curled into a soft smile as she traced her fingers along his jawline. "I already am." The kiss wasn't just a promise. It was a claim, a declaration that she was his, and he was hers. Emily melted into him, surrendering to the fire between them, and in that moment, she knew she was exactly where she belonged.